before there were generals, before there were emperors, before men carved their names into stone and prayed history would remember them, there was one name that needed no monument, one name that the wind itself seemed to carry across the Aegean, spoken in temples, whispered in barracks, and bellowed across blood-soaked fields with equal parts reverence and terror. Achilles. The Greeks called him Aristos Achaeon, the best of the Achaeans, not the strongest, not the richest, not the most cunning, the best. In a civilization that produced Odysseus the schemer, Ajax the immovable, and Agamemnon the king of kings, to be called the finest among them all was not a compliment. It was a verdict, a declaration handed down by the gods themselves. And speaking of the gods, they said his mother was one. Thetis, a sea nymph of the Nereids, immortal and grief-struck from the moment she held him. The story goes, she dipped her infant son into the river Styx, the boundary between the living world and the land of the dead, to make him untouchable, invincible, divine. Every inch of him submerged, every inch of him hardened against fate. Every inch, that is, except the heel clasped between her fingers. That one small, mortal sliver of skin. That one parenthetical the universe left open. But we'll get to that. What you need to understand first is what this man was before he became a lesson, before he became a metaphor, before schoolchildren memorized his weakness and forgot his glory. They called him Podarx, the swift-footed. They said no man alive could outrun him, that he moved across a battlefield the way a hawk moves through air, not laboring, not striding, simply arriving. Warriors trained their whole lives and still could not close the distance between themselves and Achilles. He did not fight defensively. He did not wait. He came for you, and the coming was the last thing you saw clearly. His spear, forged from the ash of Mount Pelion, was said to be a gift from the centaur Chiron, the wisest creature in the ancient world, Achilles' own tutor. And no mortal hand but his could wield it properly. When he hurled it, men said the air hummed. When it landed, kingdoms changed. He led the Myrmidons, his ferocious, fiercely loyal soldiers from Thea, onto the shores of Troy. And what followed was 10 years of war that reshaped the known world. In that decade, Achilles cut down princes. He slew Cycnus, whom men believed could not be killed by any blade. He brought Troilus to ruin before the altar of Apollo himself, an act so brazen that even the gods flinched. He toppled city after city in the Troad, sacking 12 towns by sea and 11 by land, spreading the reach of Greek dominance like fire across dry grass. But Troy is the story. Troy is always the story. At the gates of that great walled city, Achilles became something beyond a soldier. He became myth in motion. When the Trojan champion Hector, beloved son of King Priam, prince of the mightiest city in the world, killed Achilles' closest companion Patroclus, what emerged from the Greek ships in response was not grief. It was something older and colder than grief, something the Trojans would come to understand when they saw Achilles' golden armor blazing in the distance like a second sun rising on the wrong side of the sky. He chased Hector around the walls of Troy 3 times. 3 times. And when it was done, when Hector fell, Achilles was not satisfied. He tied the body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust before the watching eyes of an entire civilization. It was ruthless. It was excessive. It was the act of a man who had gone somewhere past the edge of human sorrow and was operating by entirely different rules. And yet, and here is where Achilles begins to get truly interesting, it was also the act of a man who wept, who loved, who chose. Because Achilles always knew how his story would end. He was told directly. 2 paths, his mother said, a long, quiet, forgotten life, or a short, blazing, eternal one. He chose the fire, And 3,000 years later, here we are, still talking about it. This is the story of Achilles. Every legend has a beginning. Every blade has a forge. And if you want to understand how one man became the most catastrophically effective warrior the ancient world had ever placed on a battlefield, you cannot start at Troy. You cannot start with the ships, or the screaming, or the dust rising over broken city walls. You have to start at the very beginning, with a mother who loved her son so desperately she tried to cheat death itself, and a mountain where the oldest teacher in the world was waiting. Thetis was not a woman who accepted the terms handed to her quietly. She was a Nereid, one of the 50 daughters of the sea god Nereus, immortal, luminous, and possessed of a grief that no amount of divine grace could fully conceal. Because Thetis knew something that most mothers are spared. She knew, with the cold certainty of prophecy, exactly what kind of life her son was moving toward. The fates had already made their declaration. Achilles would be extraordinary. He would be famous beyond measure, beyond time, beyond the reach of any ordinary remembrance. And he would die young. A mortal mother might have wept and surrendered to that knowledge. Thetis was not a mortal mother. The stories surrounding her earliest attempts to protect her son are strange and half-wild, carrying the texture of something that started as memory and passed through so many mouths it grew strange edges. One tradition holds that she anointed the infant Achilles with ambrosia by day, the sacred food of the gods themselves, rubbed into his skin to fill him with divine resilience from the outside in, and held him over sacred fire by night, slowly, methodically attempting to burn away the mortality threaded through his flesh. Her aim was total. She wanted every human weakness extracted from him the way poison is drawn from a wound. It was his father, King Peleus of Phthia, who put a stop to it. He found her at the fire one night, the infant suspended above the flame in her careful hands, and the shock of what he saw overrode every instinct to defer to her divinity. He tore the child away. Thetis, furious and heartbroken in equal measure, departed, returned to the sea, to her father's house beneath the waves, leaving behind a husband she could not forgive and a son she could not stop loving from a distance. What she accomplished before she left, though, was not nothing. The river Styx, the boundary between the world of the living and the kingdom of the dead, a waterway so absolute in its power that even the gods swore their most binding oaths upon it. This was her final effort. She carried the infant to its banks, held him by the heel, and submerged him completely. The Styx, they said, conferred invulnerability upon whatever it touched. The water closed over the child's body, and when it opened again, Achilles emerged, changed, sealed, fortified against blades and arrows, and the 1,000 ordinary violences that ended ordinary men. Every inch of him, that is, except the heel her fingers had clasped. One small point of contact, one place the water never reached. You could call it an oversight, but perhaps it was simply the universe insisting on its terms, that no life, regardless of how divinely forged, would be permitted to exist entirely outside the reach of consequence. He was mortal in exactly one place, and the world would find it, but not yet, not for a long time yet. The boy was brought to Mount Pelion while he was still young enough that the world was mostly impressions, color, sound, sensation. Some accounts name him as young as 6 when Peleus entrusted him to the mountain's most famous resident. Others suggest he was older, perhaps 9 or 10, already showing the early outlines of something that made people love twice. What everyone agrees on is Chiron, in a world populated by centaurs, creatures that had made a reputation for violence, drunkenness, and the kind of chaos that follows. A being who is half animal and half poorly supervised. Chiron stood entirely apart. He was their elder in years and their opposite in character. Where they were ruled by appetite, he was governed by curiosity. Where they destroyed, he studied. He had been granted a life that stretched far beyond the ordinary span of creatures, and he had used every additional year to accumulate knowledge the way a river accumulates silt, quietly, constantly, until the depth of it became its defining feature. Chiron was physician and surgeon, trained in the properties of every herb that grew on Pelion's slopes. He was astronomer, tracking the stars with the patience of a man who understood that the sky was a language and he had centuries to learn it. He was musician, philosopher, and ethicist, concerned not merely with producing capable men, but with the more difficult question of what capable men ought to do with themselves. The greatest heroes of the age had passed through his keeping. Jason, who would go on to chase the Golden Fleece across impossible distances. Heracles, already legendary in his own right even then. And now, Achilles. Chiron took one look at the boy Peleus delivered to him and understood immediately that this would be different from every student before. Not easier, not simpler, just different in scale. The education began not with weapons but with the body itself. Chiron's first and most fundamental belief was this: that a warrior who had not first mastered the instrument of his own physicality was simply a man holding an expensive piece of metal. Technique in isolation was performance. What he intended to produce was something more durable than performance, and so Achilles ran, not on flat roads, not on cleared paths, on the mountain itself, through the dense, root-tangled forest of Pelion's slopes, over rocks that rolled underfoot, across frozen streams in the depths of winter, and through knee-high grass in the heat of summer. He ran before sunrise, guided by the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the canopy. And he ran until his body had nothing left to give. And then he ran a little further, because Chiron believed that the point at which a person was certain they were finished was rarely the point at which they were actually finished. There was almost always more. But the running was not merely conditioning. It was philosophy made physical. Chiron was teaching the boy to exist at speed, to think clearly while moving fast, to make decisions not in the stillness of a training yard, but in the disorienting blur of full velocity motion, where the ground is uneven and the air is loud, and everything happens faster than the mind has been told it should. The speed that would one day leave Trojan soldiers standing stunned at their own walls, watching a figure in golden armor arrive before they had finished deciding to be afraid. That speed was not born on Olympus. It was built on Pelion, morning by grueling morning, in the dark and the cold and the mud, by a boy who had no idea yet how famous his legs would make him. The hunting came alongside the running, and here, Chiron introduced a test that became something of a fixed point in how people remembered the young Achilles' training. He was sent after stags, on foot, without weapons. The task was to run one down, to sustain pursuit long enough and at high enough speed that the animal, built specifically for escape, simply ran out of options. It was physically brutal and conceptually elegant. It forced total commitment because there was no shortcut. You could not trick a stag. You could not set a trap. You simply had to be faster, for longer, than a creature that had spent its entire existence becoming very difficult to catch. Achilles caught them. When the weapons came, they came in order, and the order was deliberate. Chiron started with the bare hands, wrestling, holds, balance work. Not because Achilles was likely to go to war without a weapon, but because Chiron understood that a man who did not know his own body in close contact with another body was missing something fundamental. He needed to know leverage. He needed to understand weight distribution, his own and his opponent's, to feel instinctively where a person's balance lived and how little it took to remove it. These were lessons the body learned differently than the mind. and Chiron was patient enough to wait until they were absorbed properly rather than merely memorized. The sword work followed, and here something revealing happened. Achilles was technically gifted, but temperamentally reluctant to be patient about it. He had the coordination, the reflex, the instinctive read of distance and timing that coaches and generals would spend their whole careers trying to find in their ranks and almost never would. What he wanted was to use it. What Chiron insisted upon, with the immovable calm that only a creature who has lived multiple human lifetimes can fully deploy, was that he understand it first. Drills. Thousands of repetitions of the same footwork patterns, the same guard transitions, the same angled cuts, not because the movements themselves were complex, but because Chiron wanted them automatic. He wanted Achilles to reach a point where the mechanics of swordplay required no conscious thought whatsoever, leaving the entirety of his considerable mind free to operate at the level of strategy, reading the opponent, anticipating the next three exchanges before they occurred. The drill was the scaffolding. What was being built inside it was something else entirely. The spear was where Achilles found his truest language, the famous ash wood shaft, cut from the forests of Pelion, balanced and weighted to a specification that Chiron had refined over decades of teaching the finest warriors of the age, was placed in Achilles' hands, and the response was immediate enough that even the unflappable centaur reportedly paused. There was an alignment that happened, a rightness, the way certain musicians pick up an instrument for the first time and seem not to be learning it, but remembering it, as though the knowledge existed somewhere prior to the lesson and only needed the correct object to wake it. Achilles threw, and the spear went where he intended it to go. He threw again, with more force, and it went further and truer. He threw at distance, at angle, uphill and downhill, and into crosswind, and each time his body made the small automatic adjustments that most men spent years being coached toward. Chiron added distance progressively. He added moving targets. He had Achilles throw while running, at full sprint, which was already extraordinary, forcing the coordination of velocity, rotation, and release into a single fluid motion. He made him throw from elevation and from below. He introduced the moment of deception, the slight misdirection of posture before release that would mislead an opponent about where the spear was actually headed. By the time this portion of training was mature, Achilles could put an ashwood shaft through a space the width of a man's throat at a distance that made observers quiet. And then, every evening, Chiron took the spear out of his hands and replaced it with a lyre. This is the detail that has puzzled and charmed people in equal measure across 3,000 years. The most ferocious warrior the ancient world would know, sitting in firelight on a mountain in Thessaly, learning music from a centaur. Chiron was deliberate about it. He had seen what happened to men whose entire inner life was organized around violence, the narrowing that occurred, the way the world shrank until it contained only targets and threats, and the maintenance of one's own lethality. He had watched gifted warriors flame out not on the battlefield, but inside themselves, consumed by what they had cultivated with no counterbalance to hold it. He would not allow that for this student. The lyre was not decoration. It was architecture, a structural element in the kind of man Chiron was building, as load-bearing as anything else in the training. Achilles took to it with a seriousness that surprised people who heard about it later and assumed it must have been reluctant, or ironic, or somehow in tension with everything else he was becoming. It was not. He sang. He played in the evenings after training with the same focused attention he gave the spear, and those who later described sharing a camp with him at Troy. Patroclus, above all others, spoke of it not as an oddity, but as one of the most quietly striking things about him, that this man, who had spent the day conducting violence on a scale that left other hardened soldiers pale and shaken, would sit at night with his instrument and find something in the music that the battlefield could not give him. Grief, perhaps. Tenderness. The particular kind of truth that only exists in melody. Chiron understood that the greatness and the gentleness in Achilles were not opposites. They were the same fire burning in two directions at once, and both of them, both, needed to be fed. The years on Pelion ended. They had to. The mountain could prepare him, but it could not complete him. Completion required the world, the full, brutal, irreversible weight of it. And the world was already beginning to call. But what descended from that mountain when the time came was not simply a trained fighter. It was something Chiron had assembled with extraordinary care, a body of supernatural capability, a mind sharpened to a point, a rage that had been aimed rather than extinguished, and somewhere underneath all of it, a heart that still knew how to break. That combination, that specific, volatile, magnificent combination, was about to introduce itself to history, and history was never going to be the same. There is a particular kind of dread that only a mother who knows the future can feel, not the ordinary fear that visits every parent in the dark hours, the nameless worry, the what-ifs, the small catastrophes the imagination assembles out of nothing. That kind of fear at least has the mercy of uncertainty. It can be argued with, dismissed on a good morning. Thetis had no such mercy. What she carried was not worry, it was knowledge, specific, detailed, unambiguous knowledge delivered by the immovable machinery of prophecy, and it told her one thing with absolute clarity. If her son went to Troy, he would not come back. She had raised him for this. She had forged him as best an immortal mother could, against every danger the world might bring to bear against him. She had placed him in the hands of the wisest teacher alive and watched from the waves as the mountain made him into something extraordinary. She had done everything a divine mother could do to prepare a mortal son for a world that was going to demand too much of him. And now that world was assembling its forces on the shores of Greece, pointing itself at a city on the far side of the Aegean. And her son's name was already being spoken among the lists of those who must go. Because of course it was. When you spent years building the most capable warrior alive, the world eventually noticed. And the world, once it had noticed, had a way of making requests that felt very much like requirements. Thetis was not finished fighting for him, not even close. To understand what she did next, you need to understand the context that was assembling itself around Achilles as he came down from Pelion and re-entered the world of men. The Trojan War. The conflict that would define an age, absorb a decade, consume tens of thousands of lives, and echo through Western consciousness for 3,000 years, began, as so many catastrophic things begin, with a wedding. Specifically, the wedding of Thetis herself to Peleus. The gods attended. The celebration was magnificent, but Eris, goddess of discord, arrived uninvited and threw a golden apple among the guests, inscribed for the fairest, and the argument it ignited between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite set in motion a chain of events that would end with Greek ships massing on the beach at Aulis, pointed at Troy. The short version, Paris, Prince of Troy, was appointed judge of the divine beauty contest. He chose Aphrodite, who rewarded him by delivering the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris took her back to Troy. Whether she went willingly or not is a conversation that has been had for 3,000 years and remains productively unresolved. What is not unresolved is what happened next. Menelaus, furious and publicly humiliated, called upon his brother Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in the Greek world. Agamemnon called upon the assembled kings and lords of the Greek world to honor their oath, because they had all sworn, every one of Helen's former suitors, to defend whichever man she ultimately married against any who might take her. It was a clever oath designed by Odysseus himself, and it had just been activated. Greece mobilized. 1,000 ships, famously, the greatest coalition of military force the ancient world had assembled. And at the head of every conversation about who needed to be there, one name kept surfacing with an insistence that brooked no argument: Achilles. There was a prophecy. There is always a prophecy, and this one was particularly inconvenient for those organizing the expedition. Troy could not be taken without Achilles. This was not a military assessment, though the military logic would have supported it. This was prophecy, delivered clearly and received seriously, because in the ancient world the two things were not always separable. Troy would not fall without the swift-footed. The war would not end. And so the need for Achilles was not simply strategic. It was cosmological. Fate itself had written his name into the outcome, in ink that could not be scratched out. Thetis knew this too. She knew her son was essential. She knew that the war would call for him with the force of destiny, and she knew what awaited him on the other side of that call. So she did something that, from a certain angle, reads as desperate. From another angle, the angle of a mother who has already tried ambrosia and the river Styx and the sacred fire, it reads as completely consistent with who she was. She hid him. The island of Skyros sits in the northern Aegean, rocky and wind-worn, ruled at the time by a king named Lycomedes. It was, by ancient standards, reasonably remote, not on the primary trade routes, not a place where armies assembled or ambassadors arrived with urgent commissions. It was the kind of place you could tuck something valuable and have reasonable hope that nobody would come looking immediately. Thetis brought her son there, before the Greek fleet had fully assembled. She brought him there, disguised, as a girl. The boy who had run down stags on Pelion's slopes. The young man who could put an ash-wood spear through a gap, the width of a man's throat from distances that made observers fall quiet. Dressed in women's robes, given a woman's name. Pyrrha, some accounts say, meaning the red-haired one, a nod to his coloring. Placed among the daughters of Lycomedes and instructed by his immortal mother to remain hidden, to remain still, to remain alive. Whether this arrangement sat easily with Achilles is something the ancient sources treat with interesting ambiguity. He was not a passive young man. He was not someone inclined toward stillness or concealment, but he was also, at this point, not yet the fully realized force he would become. He was young enough perhaps to defer to his mother's terror, and Thetis's terror was genuine and visible enough that even her son, with all his fire, could feel the weight of it. What happened on Skyros among the daughters of Lycomedes is the subject of a story that later generations would tell with considerable relish, because it involves the only recorded romantic entanglement in Achilles' early life. Among the king's daughters was one named Didamia, and whatever the arrangement Thetis had constructed, whatever the fiction of gender and identity that surrounded him, Achilles was still entirely himself underneath it. The same intensity, the same magnetic, uncontainable quality that had marked him on Pelion. Didamia saw through the disguise, or felt through it, or simply fell in love with whoever this strange, fierce girl among them actually was. They became lovers, quietly, secretly, in the way that things happen in enclosed communities when two people cannot avoid each other, and one of them carries a charge that the other cannot stop reaching toward. And when Achilles eventually left Skyros, as everyone who has heard any part of the story knows he eventually did, Didamia was pregnant with his son, a boy named Neoptolemus, who would grow up to be his own kind of warrior, his father's legacy walking around in flesh. But that, too, is a story for another chapter. The disguise held for a time, long enough to matter, not long enough to solve the problem. Because the Greeks sent Odysseus. Of course they sent Odysseus of Ithaca, the man who had invented the oath that brought this whole coalition together. The man who would spend the years after Troy trying desperately to get home and failing in the most spectacular ways imaginable. The man who was so constitutionally incapable of approaching any problem directly that he had developed the indirect approach into something approaching an art form. If you needed to find a legendary warrior who had been hidden on an island disguised as a young woman, Odysseus was the correct person to send. He was arguably the only person worth sending. He arrived at Lycomedes' court with a cover of his own. A merchant or an ambassador accounts differ, and he came bearing gifts. This is the detail that has charmed storytellers across 3 millennia, because the gifts were curated with a precision that was either inspired or deeply manipulative, depending on how generous you were feeling about Odysseus on any given day. Likely both simultaneously, which was more or less Odysseus's permanent condition. Among the fabrics and jewelry and domestic finery he laid before the king's daughters, appropriate gifts for young women of noble birth in the ancient world, he placed, with a careful casualness, a spear and a sword. He then, in some versions of the story, had a horn sounded outside, the sudden, bright, aggressive call of a military signal, the kind of sound that does absolutely nothing to the person it's designed for, if they're who they're pretending to be, and does something immediate and involuntary to the person it's actually meant for. And Achilles, standing among the daughters of Lycomedes, surrounded by silk and jewelry, reached for the spear, not reached, grabbed, with the automatic, total commitment of someone whose hand knew exactly what it was doing before the rest of him had finished deciding. The posture changed. The disguise fell away, not because anyone tore it off, but because the body underneath it simply could not maintain the performance any longer in the presence of that sound and those weapons. The daughters of Lycomedes took a collective step back. Lycomedes himself, in most accounts, had the expression of a man who had been completely deceived for months, and was now understanding that this had been entirely predictable. Odysseus introduced himself properly. The charade was over, but here is the part that matters, and that often gets lost in the entertainment of the discovery scene. Achilles did not need to be convinced. Not really. Not for long. There was a conversation, certainly. Thetis arrived in some accounts, desperate, pleading, laying out the prophecy in plain language, as though perhaps this time the words would land differently. Achilles listened. He always listened to his mother, with a tenderness that coexisted strangely and completely with everything else he was. He heard her. He understood her fear. He felt it, because he was not cold and he was not unfeeling, and he loved her in the way that a child loves a parent who has given them everything and asked only survival in return. And then he went anyway. Because the prophecy cut both ways, and Achilles had already made his peace with the edge that faced him, the short life of fire versus the long life of quiet. He had known about this choice for years, since Thetis first explained it to him with the terrible honesty of someone who cannot bring herself to lie to the person she loves most. He had carried this knowledge through Pelion, through the running and the spear work, and the evenings with the lyre, and somewhere in that carrying he had arrived at a conclusion. Fame was not nothing. Legacy was not nothing. The idea that a name could outlast the body that carried it, that a life could be woven permanently into the fabric of what human beings remembered and told each other across generations. This was not a consolation prize. To Achilles it was the point. He picked up his spear, he put on his armor, he walked toward the ships. Thetis wept in the sea, and the sea was cold, and her son did not look back. The Greek fleet assembled at Aulis was not accustomed to being impressed. These were men who had grown up with heroes, who had trained alongside princes, who had listened to the oral histories of what Heracles had done, what Perseus had accomplished, what Jason had survived, and who had organized their own sense of themselves accordingly. They were the elite of the Greek world, kings, warlords, champions, commanders, and they knew it with the easy confidence of people who have never been seriously challenged on the point. Achilles walked into that assembly and changed the atmosphere. It is difficult to reconstruct, across 3,000 years of telling and retelling, precisely what it was about him in person that produced the effect it produced. The ancient sources reach for different things: his beauty, which apparently was genuinely extraordinary, the kind that made people temporarily lose track of what they were saying; his size, which was significant without being monstrous; something about the way he moved, which the poets describe as simultaneously relaxed and coiled, the gait of a creature that was never not ready; and above everything else, the quality of his attention. When Achilles looked at you, they said, you felt that he was looking at all of you. Not your face, not your rank, not the armor or the weapons or the social position that men of that world relied upon to establish themselves. All of it, through it, at whatever was actually there. It was not always comfortable, but it was, without exception, memorable. Agamemnon, king of kings, received him with the calculated warmth of a man who understood power and wanted to establish its hierarchy immediately. Agamemnon was a formidable figure, commanding in bearing, politically sophisticated, accustomed to deference from men who were themselves accustomed to receiving it. He was the commander of this entire enterprise, the organizing force behind a military coalition of a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. He was accustomed to being the most important person in any given room. He looked at Achilles and felt, if the accounts are to be believed, something he had not expected to feel: a competitive awareness, a recognition, reluctant and unwelcome, that the hierarchy he was used to inhabiting had developed a complication. Not a challenge, not yet, not openly, but a presence that did not automatically arrange itself below him the way every other presence did. Achilles was not insubordinate in those early days. He was not reckless with his standing or inflammatory in his behavior. He simply existed with a self-possession so complete that deference, when it was offered, looked like a choice he was making rather than a condition of his nature. This was noticed by everyone. Ajax the Greater, the enormous, iron-steady Telamonian warrior who was himself considered by most measures the second finest fighter in the Greek world, greeted Achilles with something much simpler than Agamemnon's complicated appraisal. Ajax was not a complicated man. He was vast and powerful and loyal with a simplicity that made the complicated people around him uncomfortable, and the uncomplicated people love him completely. He looked at Achilles with the straightforward recognition of one exceptional physical creature identifying another, extended his hand, and the two of them built a rapport that was built on the simplest possible foundation: mutual respect between people who knew what the other was capable of, because they could see it. Patroclus was already there. This requires dwelling on, because Patroclus and what he meant to Achilles is not a footnote in this story. It is structural. It is load-bearing. Patroclus was Achilles' closest companion. The precise nature of that closeness has been interpreted and reinterpreted and argued over by scholars and poets and philosophers since antiquity, and the ancient world itself carried multiple understandings of it simultaneously without finding this contradictory. What is not argued is the intensity. What is not disputed is that Patroclus was the person in whose presence Achilles was most fully himself. Not the warrior, not the legend in assembly, not the terrifying figure men constructed around his reputation, but the person Chiron's lyre had partially revealed. The one who felt things. The one who could be moved. Patroclus was the softer counterweight to everything sharp in Achilles' nature. Gentler in temperament, more socially fluent, quicker to empathy, and slower to anger. Where Achilles moved through a room and left people slightly unsettled, Patroclus moved through one and left people slightly warmer. They had known each other from childhood. Patroclus was older by some accounts, attached to Achilles' household, present through the years on Pelion's edges, if not on the mountain itself. and the bond between them was the kind that forms when two people are young enough and spend enough time together that they grow partially into each other's shape. Achilles, for all his self-sufficiency, his completeness as a physical and martial force, was incomplete in one direction that only Patroclus occupied. The other commanders watched this relationship with varying degrees of understanding. Odysseus understood it perfectly and filed it away under things that might be useful later. Agamemnon understood it less well, which would eventually become a catastrophic failure of intelligence on his part. Nestor, the ancient king of Pylos, who had outlived 3 generations of warriors and navigated every kind of man the Greek world could produce, understood it immediately and completely, in the way that old men who have watched enough love and war understand that these two things are always more entangled than the young think they are. What the men around Achilles perceived, in those days of assembly and preparation before the fleet sailed, was not quite a single unified picture. He was too multidimensional for that, and the ancient sources are honest about the range of reactions he produced. Among the common soldiers, the rank and file, the men who would do the bulk of the dying at Troy without anyone writing epic poetry about them afterward, Achilles occupied a specific position in the imagination that was more mythological than personal. They had heard the stories. Many of them had been told the stories since childhood, the way children are told stories about forces of nature, about things that exist on a scale different from ordinary human experience. He was the son of a goddess. He had trained with Chiron. He could not be killed by any weapon that touched the parts of him the Styx had sealed. These were not small things to carry into a war. The soldiers who would march and bleed alongside him drew a particular kind of confidence from his presence that was categorically different from the confidence they drew from having many ships or well-organized supply lines. He was a proof of concept. Evidence that the universe had, on at least one occasion, taken a side. A man walking among them who demonstrated by his very existence that the gods had not entirely abandoned interest in the Greek cause. Among the other commanders and kings, the perception was more complicated and more personal. There was admiration, even from those who would have preferred not to feel it, because admiration for Achilles required a corresponding acknowledgement that he occupied a rank above you that no title or land could close the gap on. There was wariness. There was, in some quarters, the carefully managed resentment of men who had spent their whole lives being exceptional and had now been presented with a data point that reframed their exceptionalism as second place. And there was, among the most perceptive of them, something that functioned almost like concern, a recognition that this much concentrated greatness, this much fire and capability and barely aimed rage was going to be extraordinary as an ally and potentially devastating as anything else. Odysseus perceived him with the precision of a man who catalogued everything. The speed, beyond what he had expected, and he had expected a great deal. The intelligence, which surprised people who had constructed a simpler picture of what a supreme physical specimen was likely to contain mentally. The pride, which Odysseus noted carefully and filed beside everything else, because pride of that magnitude was the most powerful lever in the world, and also the most dangerous one to be anywhere near when someone tried to push it the wrong way. Odysseus liked Achilles, in the specific way that people of great and complementary gifts tend to like each other when they are not in direct competition. He also, quietly, never stopped calculating. And Agamemnon saw a tool he needed, a subordinate he could not fully control, and a problem he was not yet wise enough to take seriously. He would spend the first 9 years of the war managing this perception successfully enough, and then, in the 10th year, he would make a decision so profoundly miscalculated, so fundamentally wrong in its reading of who Achilles was and what moved him, that the entire war would nearly end in Greek catastrophe. But the ships had not yet sailed. The fleet was still assembled at Aulis, restless and waiting, the wind not yet cooperating, the omens still being read and interpreted and argued over by the priests. And on the beach, among the gathered armies of Greece, a young man from Phia stood with a spear in his hand and the sea at his back and the horizon ahead of him. And he was everything his mother feared, and everything the world required. He was 20 years old, give or take. He had never seen Troy. He was already, without a single battle yet to his name, the most famous warrior alive. And he knew, with the peculiar, wide-awake peace of someone who has already accepted the terms, exactly what going to that horizon was going to cost him. He went anyway. He always went anyway. That was the thing about Achilles that the legends sometimes softened, and the man himself never did. The choice was made not in ignorance but in full view of the consequence. Not recklessness, not blind courage. Something quieter and more absolute than either of those things. He had decided what he was worth, and he was going to spend it. There is a difference between a man who is pulled into greatness and a man who walks toward it with his eyes completely open. History is full of the first kind. Men who stumbled into significance, who were present at the right moment through accident or geography, or the simple arithmetic of being the last one standing, who rose because everything around them fell, and rising was merely what was left to do. These men are not unimportant. Their stories are not unworthy of telling, but they are not the story of Achilles. Achilles arrived at Troy the way a storm arrives, not accidentally, not reluctantly, not pulled there by forces outside himself. He came with intentions so total and so clear that the men around him felt it as a kind of weather, something atmospheric, something that changed the pressure of the air and made everyone in the vicinity stand slightly differently, breathe slightly differently, recalculate what was possible. He did not come to Troy to participate. He came to conduct, and from the first moment the Greek ships touched that foreign shore, it was evident to everyone watching, friend and enemy alike, that something had arrived on this beach that had not been part of their calculations, that the war they had all been preparing for, the war that each side had organized its courage and its strategy around, was going to be a different war that anyone had anticipated, because Achilles stepped off a ship and went looking for it immediately. And what happened next would set the tone for 9 years of the most extraordinary individual military performance the ancient world would ever witness or record. The landing itself was the first test, and it was not a small one. The Greeks had been warned, again, through the reliable machinery of prophecy that seemed to run continuously in the background of this entire enterprise, that the first man to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first man to die. This information had a predictable effect on the assembled warriors of the greatest military coalition in the ancient world. Nobody moved. Ships bobbed in the shallows. Oars were held. Eyes went to Agamemnon. Eyes went to Odysseus. Eyes went to Ajax. Eyes went to each other, in the way that eyes go to each other when everyone is waiting for someone else to do the thing that nobody wants to do. There are varying accounts of exactly what happened in those first moments on the shore. Some say Achilles leapt from the ship without pause, without ceremony, simply stepped off the prow into shallow water and walked toward the beach with the same energy he brought to everything, forward momentum as a permanent condition. Others add theatrical detail, that he threw his spear onto the beach first and then jumped after it, claiming the soil with the weapon before the body, a technicality that turned the prophecy sideways, if not entirely around it. Either way, the outcome was the same. He went first. The prophecy took Protesilaus instead, a noble Greek commander who followed in those first critical moments and fell almost immediately to a Trojan spear, becoming the first Greek casualty of the war, exactly as foretold. But the gesture of going first, of stepping forward into a situation where everyone knew the first man to arrive might well be the first man to die. This was not missed, not by the Greeks watching from the ships, who went over the side in Achilles' wake with an urgency that had been completely absent 30 seconds before. Not by the Trojans watching from the shore, who had been holding position with reasonable confidence, until that figure appeared in the shallows and began walking toward them without slowing down. Not by Hector, standing among the Trojan defenders, watching the Greek forces pour off their ships now with the tide of momentum fully reversed. If the accounts are accurate, it was here, on the beach, in those first chaotic minutes, that Hector first truly registered what his city was dealing with. He was not a man easily rattled. He was experienced, disciplined, brave, in the specific, deep, and quiet way that great soldiers are brave, which is more durable than the loud and obvious kind. But he watched Achilles on that beach, and something in his assessment shifted, something that looked very much like the long thought of a man revising his expectations significantly and not finding the revision comfortable. The beach was taken. The Greeks established their camp, and the war, which had been abstract and conceptual and distant for all the months of gathering and sailing, became immediately, viscerally real. In the weeks and months that followed, while the great formal machinery of siege warfare ground slowly into motion, the negotiations, the positioning, the construction of the Greek defensive wall around their camp, the first tentative large-scale engagements on the plain before Troy's walls, Achilles was not waiting. He was raiding. This is the part of Achilles' story at Troy that does not always receive the attention it deserves, because the dramatic focal points of the Trojan War narrative, the duel of Paris and Menelaus, the great battles on the plain, Hector and Patroclus, and the final devastating confrontation, tend to absorb the light entirely. But for the first 9 years of this war, what Achilles was doing was conducting a campaign of systematic devastation across the entire surrounding region that was, by any reasonable military measure, as important to the eventual Greek victory as any single battle fought before Troy's walls. He took his myrmidons, those ferocious, disciplined soldiers from Phia, who had followed him to Troy with a loyalty that operated almost below the level of choice, more like gravity than decision, and he moved. He moved with the speed and the planning that Chiron's mountain had built into him, and he hit city after city across the Troad with a consistency that made the surrounding populations of that entire region understand something clearly. There was no safe distance. There was no reasonable assumption that Troy's war was Troy's problem, and that staying out of it would buy protection. 12 cities by sea, 11 by land, 23 separate military operations, each requiring planning, logistics, coordination, and the kind of combat effectiveness that most commanders would have been proud to apply to 3 or 4 actions in an entire career. Achilles conducted them as a continuous, rolling campaign, returning to the Greek camp between raids to resupply and communicate with Agamemnon, then going out again. The cities fell. The resources flowed back to the Greek camp, supplies, materials, and the enslaved captives that were the brutal economics of ancient warfare. The surrounding territory that might otherwise have reinforced or resupplied Troy instead provided material for the Greek siege. It was strategy executed through Achilles' particular instrument of total physical dominance, and it worked with a ruthless efficiency that the other Greek commanders could observe and appreciate, even if none of them could have replicated it. Among the captives taken in these raids was a woman named Briseis, from the city of Lyrnessus. She became part of Achilles' share of the prizes, which, in the ethics and customs of the ancient world, was the formalized recognition of his contribution to a campaign's success. This detail will become enormously important. Remember it. On the plain before Troy, when the great formal engagements happened, Achilles was something that soldiers on both sides experienced differently depending on which direction they were facing. For the Greeks, he was the fixed point, the constant, on days when the battle was going badly, when the Trojan forces under Hector were pushing with the kind of disciplined, coordinated violence that Hector was extraordinarily good at organizing. There was always the knowledge that Achilles was somewhere on that field, that whatever the momentary state of the engagement, there was a term in the equation that could not be cancelled. The psychology of this was not small. Armies fight partly with their weapons, and partly with their belief in what is possible. And the Greeks believed in what was possible in a way that was specifically and substantially grounded in the figure of the swift-footed, moving through the dust at the battlefield's edge. For the Trojans, the experience was different in character and in kind. There were Trojan warriors of genuine quality, Hector foremost among them obviously, but Aeneas as well, and Sarpedon of Lycia, who led his allied forces with a brilliance that even Homer would honor generously. These were not men without courage or capability. They were not defeated before they started. On days when Achilles was absent from the field, occupied elsewhere, resting, or withdrawn for reasons that would later become the central crisis of the war, the Trojans fought with a confidence that reflected their actual strength accurately. They pushed, they held, they even, on several notable occasions, drove the Greeks back toward their ships with a force that brought the entire Greek enterprise trembling to its edge. And on days when Achilles was present and engaged, something else happened. The accounts are consistent across sources that were written independently and at different times, which gives them a particular weight. The Trojans, when they saw him coming, did not hold. Not because they were cowards. They had demonstrated comprehensively that they were not, but because the rational calculation of what engaging Achilles directly looked like had become, over time, too well established to ignore. Men had tried, good men, brave men, men who had trained their whole lives and fought effectively in every other context the war had presented them. They had tried to meet Achilles on the field, and the results had been, without exception, conclusive. There was Cycnus, son of Poseidon, whom legend held could not be killed by any blade, divine parentage conferring a protection not entirely unlike Achilles' own. Achilles killed him, not with a blade, with his bare hands, or with the strap of his own helmet turned into a strangling implement, depending on the account. The specific mechanism mattered less than the fact. A man who could not be killed by conventional weapons met Achilles and was dead shortly afterward, because Achilles simply located a different solution and applied it without losing momentum. There was Troilus, young prince of Troy, barely on the edge of manhood, caught in the open by the swift-footed, and pursued to the sanctuary of Apollo's own temple. A sanctuary that was supposed to be inviolable. That was supposed to be the one space in any landscape where the machinery of war stopped operating out of respect for the divine. Achilles pursued him there anyway, killed him at the altar. It was an act that shocked even his own allies. That made the gods take notice with something darker than approval. That added a particular charge to Apollo's existing feelings about Achilles, a charge that would eventually find its moment with terrible precision. But in the immediate present, on the plain, the act confirmed something that the Trojans had already begun to understand. Achilles did not recognize the same limits that other men recognized. Not physical limits, which was already known. Not moral limits, which was becoming clearer. He operated by a code that was internally consistent and absolutely his own, and that bore a relationship to conventional rules that was selective at best. He was not lawless. He had his own law, strict and deeply felt. But it was his, and no external authority had ever successfully impressed itself upon it in a way that stuck. The other Greek commanders observed this with the full range of reactions that complex men have to someone who is simultaneously invaluable and ungovernable. Nestor, ancient and patient, watched Achilles with the specific melancholy of a man who had once been young and extraordinary himself, and who understood with painful clarity both what that felt like from the inside and what it looked like from the outside. He gave advice. Nestor was constitutionally incapable of withholding advice. It was both his greatest contribution and his most reliable social liability, and some of it was good advice, offered gently, with the awareness that Achilles would take exactly as much of it as aligned with what he had already decided, and no more. He did not take this personally. He had lived long enough to know that the very quality that made Achilles what he was also made him precisely this resistant to external steering. Diomedes, another of the great Greek fighters, had a relationship with Achilles that was more fraternal than hierarchical. Two exceptional warriors who respected each other in the compressed, largely wordless way that people of similar caliber tend to, finding the recognition of genuine equality more interesting than the management of a ranking. Diomedes was himself formidable enough to have wounded gods in the course of this war, literally put a spear through Ares, the god of war himself, in an episode that the ancient sources describe with the breathless delight of narrators who can barely believe what they are reporting, which gave him a particular standing in the community of the extraordinary that most men could not access. Odysseus circled Achilles the way a moon circles a large planet, maintaining a respectful orbital distance, occasionally coming closer to apply some specific and carefully calculated gravity of his own, always aware of the pull and always calculating the trajectory. He never tried to manage Achilles directly. He was too intelligent for that. He worked the environment instead. The conversations in the council, the framing of situations, the patient arrangement of circumstances that might move Achilles toward useful outcomes without triggering the one thing Odysseus most wanted to avoid: the absolute, total, gravity-defying withdrawal of someone who had decided he was done cooperating. He managed this successfully for 9 years. Then Agamemnon made it irrelevant. Ajax the Greater simply loved him, in the uncomplicated, declarative way that Ajax loved things he found worthy. They competed, because they could not be in the same space without the comparison existing. It was too obvious, like two rivers converging, and anyone watching being unable to not wonder which was the stronger current. But the competition did not corrode the affection. When they raced, Ajax lost. Ajax was large enough in character to find this interesting rather than intolerable, which was a significant achievement, given the era's general architecture of masculine pride. He remained loyal to Achilles through the various crises and complications of those 10 years, with a consistency that said more about both of them than any battle record could. And the Trojans who watched from their walls, who sent their sons and brothers and husbands down onto that plain and received fewer of them back when Achilles was active on it, built their own understanding of him over years of cumulative, painful evidence. He was not hated, precisely. Hatred is a form of relationship, and you can hate someone you understand. What the Trojans felt was more complex than that. There was fear, obviously. Fear of the concrete and specific kind that is based on watching what happens when the thing you fear reaches someone near you, and extrapolating efficiently. There was also something that functioned almost like awe, the same involuntary, uncomfortable recognition of greatness that the Greeks felt, stripped of the comfort of it being on their side. You could see it in the way the Trojan defenders on the walls reacted when certain figures appeared on the plain below. Other Greeks produced tactical concern. Achilles produced stillness. People stopped moving. People stopped speaking. People watched. Priam, king of Troy, old and white-haired and in possession of more sons than he would ultimately bury in the course of this war, watched Achilles from the walls with an expression that those near him described as beyond category. He had ruled for a long time. He had seen extraordinary things in the span of a long reign. He watched the swift-footed move across the plain below his city, and reportedly said, more than once, that he did not know whether he was looking at a man. The observation was not mystical posturing from an old king who had run out of useful things to say. It was the honest conclusion of someone applying extensive experience to an observation that did not fit into any existing category of human behavior he possessed. Hector watched him differently. with a focus that was professional in its precision and personal in its weight. Hector understood that the war lived and died on one axis, the axis between himself and Achilles. Everything else, the politics of the alliance, the involvement of the gods, the tactical maneuvering on the plain, the management of allied forces, the supply lines and the long arithmetic of siege. All of it was secondary to this one fundamental opposition. He and Achilles had not yet met in direct combat, and Hector was clear-eyed enough about what that meeting would mean that he managed its postponement with careful intelligence, not from cowardice, from a correct reading of the strategic situation, which said, as long as Hector lived, Troy had its center. Without Hector, Troy lost something that could not be replaced with 10,000 additional soldiers. He watched Achilles across the plain and prepared, sharpened himself against the knowledge of what was coming, the way a blade is sharpened against stone, knowing that it was coming, knowing, with the quiet and devastating clarity of a man who loved his city and his family enough to be honest with himself about their odds, that it was probably coming sooner than later. He went home each evening to Andromache, his wife, held his infant son, stood at the walls and looked out at the Greek camp, and Achilles slept in his tent by the ships, with Patroclus nearby, and his spear propped against the entrance, and the sound of the Aegean coming in under the canvas, and the city he had come to take visible on the horizon in the clear Anatolian dark. Neither man sought peace. Both men understood this was not a war that had a version in which everyone went home. The only question was the sequence. The only question was who and when and in what order the losses would arrive. The answer was already written. It was always already written, and the plain was waiting, patient as stone, for the morning that would finally bring the two of them to it at the same time with nothing left between them. 9 years. 9 years of grinding, brutal, inconclusive siege. 9 years of men sleeping in tents on a foreign beach, eating hard rations, watching the walls of Troy stand every morning exactly as they had stood the evening before. 9 years of raids and skirmishes and pitched battles on the plain that accomplished enormous amounts of dying without accomplishing the one thing the Greeks had sailed 3,000 miles to accomplish. 9 years of Agamemnon's coalition, holding together through the sheer centripetal force of commitment, too deep to reverse, and pride too vast to admit failure. And through all 9 of those years, the single most important reason the Greeks had not already packed up their ships and gone home was also the single most volatile element in the entire enterprise, Achilles, who had fought and bled and killed and raided and made the entire surrounding territory of Troy into a Greek tributary, who had built a body of work in those 9 years that had no precedent and would have no successor, who had done everything asked of him, and more than asked, more than was possible to ask, and who had done it with such totality that the entire Greek cause had become structurally dependent on his continuation in a way that Agamemnon understood intellectually, but had never fully reckoned with emotionally. That failure to reckon would become, in the 10th year, the most catastrophic leadership error in the history of the war, possibly in the history of Greek military command, arguably in the history of human beings making decisions they cannot take back. It began with a woman and a priest and a plague. A Trojan priest of Apollo, named Chryses, came to the Greek camp bearing ransom for his daughter Chryses, who had been taken in one of the raids and assigned to Agamemnon as a prize. The old man came humbly, carrying the symbols of his god and the weight of a father's desperation, and asked for his daughter back. It was not an unreasonable request. It was, by the customs of the ancient world, the kind of request that had a customary response involving basic human decency. Agamemnon refused, dismissed the old priest, sent him away with the particular cruelty of a man who has enough power to be unkind and has not recently been reminded of the cost of that indulgence. Apollo heard. Apollo responded. The god of the silver bow sent plague into the Greek camp with an efficiency that left no ambiguity about its source or its message. Men began dying, not in battle, in their beds, suddenly, with the terrible intimacy of divine punishment that does not bother with the formality of fighting. The camp was decimated, the pyres burned for days. Achilles called an assembly. This itself was significant. He was not the commander of this expedition, not the king of kings, not the man with formal authority to summon councils. He called one anyway, because men were dying and no one else was moving. And waiting for proper procedure when people were burning on funeral pyres was the kind of patience Achilles had never possessed and saw no reason to develop now. He demanded answers. He demanded the seer Calchas reveal the source of Apollo's anger, and he guaranteed Calchas's safety when the seer looked nervously at Agamemnon before speaking, understanding that what he was about to say was not going to be received warmly by the most powerful man in the room. Calchas spoke. The answer was exactly what it appeared to be. Chryseis must be returned to her father. The plague would stop when Apollo's priest had his daughter back. Agamemnon erupted, not because he disagreed with the diagnosis, he was not stupid, but because the diagnosis required him to lose something, and losing something publicly in front of assembled kings and soldiers in response to what felt like external compulsion violated every instinct of a man whose entire identity was organized around the demonstration of superiority. He agreed to return Chryseis. And then, in the move that would define his legacy in the worst possible way, he announced that he would take Briseis instead. Achilles' prize. The woman from Lyranessus, who had been formally awarded to Achilles as recognition of his contribution to 9 years of this war. The silence that followed this announcement was the particular silence of rooms in which something has just been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone present understands this simultaneously. Achilles went very still. Those who knew him well, Patroclus, Ajax, Nestor, the handful of men who had spent enough time in his immediate presence to read the register of his stillness, recognized this as the most dangerous kind. Not the hot stillness that preceded an explosion of temper he would recover from quickly. The cold kind. The kind that meant something had shifted below the surface, at a level that temper could not reach and could not repair. His hand went to his sword. The accounts are specific about this. His hand went to his sword, and for a moment, one moment, suspended and absolute, the war nearly became an entirely different war. The war in which Achilles drew a blade inside the Greek camp, and the history of everything that followed changed completely. What stopped him, in the tradition that Homer would later canonize, was the intervention of Athena, appearing to him alone, invisible to the room, gripping his golden hair and pulling him back from the precipice with a goddess's certainty that this was not the correct expression of this rage and not the correct moment for this particular consequence. He sheathed the sword. He used words instead, and the words he chose were the kind that land differently than steel, but cut to comparable depth. He called Agamemnon a drunkard, a coward, a king who had never fought in the front lines of a battle he commanded, and who fed on the contributions of better men while offering the leadership of a man who ruled by accident of birth rather than merit of character. He said all of this in front of the assembled commanders of the entire Greek coalition. And then he announced that he was done. Done fighting. Done raiding. Done contributing anything whatsoever to Agamemnon's war. He and the Myrmidons would stay in their camp. They would watch. When the Greeks finally understood what they had been relying on for 9 years, when they felt the absence of it, the way you feel the absence of a wall you didn't know you were sheltering behind until the wind hits you directly, then perhaps Agamemnon would understand what he had done. Briseis was taken by Agamemnon's heralds. Achilles let her go because he had said he would, and because he was making a point that required following through on its terms completely. He went to the shore, and he called to the sea, and his mother came up from beneath the waves and held him while he wept, not for Briseis specifically, but for the magnitude of the insult, for the 9 years of everything that Agamemnon had just casually erased, for a rage so total it had nowhere sufficient to go. And Thetis listened and promised to take his case to Zeus himself, to have the king of the gods tilt the war against the Greeks until the absence of her son made Agamemnon feel what he had done with the full weight of consequence. Zeus granted it. He owed Thetis a favor that predated the war by some distance, and he paid it. And the Greeks began to lose. What happened to the Greek forces in the weeks that followed Achilles' withdrawal is one of the most instructive military episodes in the entire ancient tradition, because it demonstrated with terrible clarity the difference between an army that contained Achilles and an army that did not. Hector, freed from the specific calculation that had kept him cautious on the plain for 9 years, moved. He moved with the confidence of a commander who had just had the most dangerous variable removed from his opponent's equation, and the results were immediate and severe. The Greeks were pushed back, then pushed back further, then pushed back to the point where the fighting reached their defensive wall, the wall they had built to protect the ships. And then the wall itself was breached, because Hector found a gap in it and drove through with the focused fury of a man who understood that this might be the moment and who was not going to waste it by being cautious. The Greeks were fighting at their own ships, ships that represented not just their means of going home, but the symbolic heart of their identity as an expeditionary force. When an army is fighting at its ships, it is fighting with its back against the edge of everything, and the psychological effect of that proximity to total defeat is not easily managed. Commanders who had been confident, organized, effective for 9 years were rattled in a way that the grinding difficulty of siege warfare had never managed to rattle them. Because siege warfare, for all its attrition, has a horizon. You can see where you stand. There is a wall, and you are outside it, and the question is patience and supply. This was different. This was the Greek coalition discovering, in real time, that the question of their survival had always been more closely attached to one man's willingness to fight than any of them had fully confronted. Odysseus recognized it first. Odysseus always recognized things first. It was both his gift and his particular burden, to see clearly in situations that other men were still squinting at. He organized an embassy. 3 men, chosen for their relationships with Achilles, Phoenix, who had been like a surrogate father to him since childhood. Ajax, whose loyalty and physical comparability made him the least threatening messenger available. And Odysseus himself, because whatever else he was the finest persuader in the Greek world, and this situation required the finest available. They went to Achilles' tent. They found him exactly as the legends always place him in this moment, playing his lyre, singing to himself, with Patroclus sitting nearby, both of them removed from the war, with an equanimity that suggested they had made a genuine peace with the withdrawal. He received them without surprise and with genuine warmth, because he had no quarrel with these men. He ordered food and drink prepared. He was a host before he was anything else. And then they made their case. Agamemnon, they said, had sent magnificent gifts, treasure, horses, the return of Briseis with an oath that she had not been touched, and the promise of cities and honors and a place above all other Greeks in the hierarchy of the expedition. All of this was waiting. The army needed him. The Greeks were dying at their ships. Would he not come back? The speech Achilles gave in response is one of the oldest pieces of extended human reflection on the relationship between honor, mortality, and what a life is worth. He had been promised, he said, 2 possible fates. He had chosen the short one, chosen it freely, chosen it for the glory. But what was glory when the man who commanded this war could take away a man's prize as casually as scratching a name off a list? What was the point of excellence when excellence provided no protection against the arbitrary power of someone who outranked you in title, even if in nothing else? He had fought and bled for 9 years and had been treated as a resource to be managed rather than a man to be honored. He was going home. Phoenix wept. Ajax was blunt, as Ajax always was, cutting through the philosophical framework to say essentially that men were dying, and friendship had claims that pride should yield to. Even Ajax could not reach him. Odysseus, to his immense credit, did not push. He read the room with the accuracy of a man who had spent a lifetime reading rooms, and understood that there was no combination of words available that was going to move Achilles tonight, and that pushing further would only calcify the position. He thanked Achilles for his hospitality and withdrew with what he had actually managed to salvage from the embassy, which was Achilles' reluctant acknowledgement that he would consider fighting again if the battle reached his own ships directly. It was not enough, but it was something. And Odysseus had learned long ago to be precise about the distinction. What broke the withdrawal was not Agamemnon. It was never going to be Agamemnon. It was Patroclus, who had watched the Greeks dying for days with an anguish that Achilles could feel but could not share, because the principle that had driven him to this shore would not bend to the suffering of strangers, however terrible. Patroclus, who understood Achilles better than anyone alive, and who knew exactly which argument to make and how to make it. He came to Achilles not with Agamemnon's case. He came with his own. "Let me go," he said. "Let me take the Myrmidons and your armor, your famous, recognizable, fear-inducing armor, and let the Trojans think Achilles has returned. The sight of it will give the Greeks something to rally around and will give the Trojans something to reconsider. Let me push them back from the ships, that much at least." Achilles agreed, with conditions. Patroclus was to push the Trojans back from the ships, relieve the immediate crisis, and then stop. Come back. Do not press the pursuit toward the walls of Troy. This was not a full return to the war. This was a surgical intervention, limited and controlled. Patroclus understood the conditions, agreed to them, put on the armor, led the Myrmidons out onto the plain. What happened on that plain is one of the most consequential sequences of events in all of ancient literature, because everything that follows, everything, flows from it. The sight of the armor worked exactly as planned. The Trojans, seeing what they believed to be Achilles returning, faltered. The psychology of it was total and immediate. The Greeks rallied with the relief of a besieged population seeing their walls suddenly reinforced. Patroclus fought brilliantly. He pushed the Trojans back. He did what he had come to do, and then he didn't stop. Whether it was the momentum of success, the intoxication of battle, or simply the oldest story in military history, the tactical situation that looks like one more push and the war is over, if you just go a little further. Patroclus carried the pursuit toward the walls of Troy itself, directly toward them, into the range of every defensive advantage the city possessed, and directly into the attention of Apollo, who had been watching this war with an investment that was personal and deep. Apollo struck him first, knocked his helmet from his head, shattered his spear, stripped his divine borrowed armor piece by piece with invisible blows that left him staggering and exposed. Then Euphorbus put a spear through him, and then Hector, reading what had happened with the battlefield clarity of a commander who had spent 9 years surviving this war through intelligent assessment, delivered the killing blow. Patroclus fell. His last words, to Hector standing over him, were reported with the specific precision of someone delivering a message they knew would travel further than the moment. Achilles would come for him. Make no mistake about that. Whatever calculations Hector was making about his own future, he should factor in what was coming. Hector looked at the dying man and said that he did not know which of them fate would take first. He stripped the armor from Patroclus, the famous armor, Achilles' armor, and a runner went to the Greek ships with the worst news of the war. There is a moment described in the oldest accounts of this war that has not lost its power across 3,000 years of telling. When the news reached Achilles, he fell to the earth and covered himself in dust. He tore at his hair with both hands. He lay on the ground in the grey Aegean twilight and made sounds that the men around him, hardened soldiers, men who had seen every variety of human suffering the previous 9 years could produce, found unbearable to witness. Not because it was undignified, because it was so completely, nakedly real. Because the thing that lived inside Achilles, underneath all the speed and the spear work, and the invulnerability and the divine inheritance, was a person who loved someone, and that someone was gone, and no armor in the world could be applied to that particular wound. Thetis came again from the sea. She held him again. She listened again. And this time, when she heard what he intended to do, she did not argue, because she knew. Because the sequence that had always been coming was now arriving on its own schedule, regardless of anything she did. And the only thing left was to be his mother in whatever time remained. She went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, the god of the forge. She asked for new armor. Hephaestus, who owed Thetis a debt of gratitude that went back further than the war, worked through the night. What he produced was described by those who later tried to articulate it as less like equipment and more like a statement. A shield depicting the entire world, the heavens, the earth, the sea, the cities of men in peace and war, the agricultural cycles, the cosmic order, all of it hammered into divine metal, with an artistry that no mortal craftsman could approach. It was armor that announced before a single blow was struck that the person inside it was not operating on an ordinary scale. Achilles put it on in the morning, and the withdrawal, the magnificent, principled, catastrophically costly withdrawal, ended. What he did in the days that followed defies orderly narration, because it was not orderly. It was a force of nature moving through a battlefield, and forces of nature do not have structure that fits neatly into the language of military reporting. He reconciled with Agamemnon publicly and completely, with the decisive briskness of a man who has decided that the grievance no longer matters because something larger has replaced it. The gifts were accepted. Briseis returned. He dismissed all of it as irrelevant to what he was about to do, which was true. He had no interest in the argument anymore. He had interest in one thing only. He drove the Trojans back across the plain, not with strategy, not with the disciplined tactical precision of a commander managing a complex engagement, with the furious, single-pointed momentum of a man who had converted grief into velocity and was now applying it to every Trojan soldier between him and the walls of the city. The plain ran red. The river Scamander, choked with bodies, reportedly rose against him. The river god himself, objecting to the volume of dead being introduced into his waters, rising in divine fury to try to drown the man depositing them there. Achilles fought a river, with his spear in the current, shouting at the water. And the river god, who had the full authority of a divinity in his own domain, could not stop him. He killed Lycaon, a son of Priam, who had been previously captured and ransomed, and had begged for his life on those grounds. Achilles told him plainly that the time for mercy had closed, that the death of Patroclus had ended that particular door. He killed Asteropaeus, champion of the Paeonians, who wounded him first, wounded Achilles, which required a spear thrown from both hands simultaneously and divine ancestry to accomplish, and which still did not change the outcome. He was like fire moving through dry grass, and the grass had no argument against fire that fire was interested in hearing. Hector watched from inside the walls of Troy as the carnage consumed his people. He watched his father Priam and his mother Hecuba stand on the walls above the Scaean gates and beg him not to face Achilles alone. His father, weeping, told him what Achilles would do to the city if Hector fell. His mother showed him her grief with a plainness that was beyond strategy, beyond royal dignity, a woman simply being a mother and asking her son not to die today. They were not wrong. They knew exactly what was on the plain below and what facing it alone meant. Hector stayed outside the gate anyway. He waited for Achilles alone on the plain before Troy, and when Achilles came, in his divine armor, blazing like a second sun on the wrong side of the horizon, Hector ran. It is important to say this with the weight it deserves, because Hector was not a coward. He had demonstrated the opposite comprehensively for 10 years. What happened in that moment was not cowardice. It was the body overriding the will. It was the animal underneath the soldier making a calculation that the soldier's resolve could not countermand. 3 times around the walls of Troy he ran, Achilles behind him, neither man pulling ahead until Athena intervened, appearing to Hector in the shape of his brother Deiphobus, offering to stand with him, giving him the belief that he was not facing Achilles alone. He stopped. He turned. He proposed terms, that whichever of them won would return the other's body to his people with honor, that there would be no desecration, that the dead would be treated with the dignity the dead deserved. Achilles told him there were no terms, that the time for terms between them was gone the way all other times were gone, that there was only this. Hector threw first. The spear hit Achilles' divine shield and fell away uselessly. He turned for his brother Deiphobus to take his spear. There was no brother there. Deiphobus had never been there. He understood, in the last full moment of his understanding, what had happened and what it meant. He drew his sword. He charged. Achilles threw. The spear found the one gap in Hector's armor, the hollow of the throat above the collarbone. Hector fell. He asked, dying, for his body to be returned to his father. He asked this of a man who had lost Patroclus and was still in the first, unmodified, untreated fury of that loss. Achilles refused in terms that the ancient sources recorded and that Hector carried with him into death. Hector of Troy died on the plain before his own city, his father watching from the walls, his wife watching, his infant son too young to understand and old enough to remember forever. Achilles tied the body to his chariot, and he dragged it. 3 times he dragged Hector's body around the walls of Troy, and the city watched from above, and the grief that came down from those walls was total and encompassing and without end. The gods themselves objected. Apollo preserving the body from corruption and desecration through divine intervention, unwilling to allow the humiliation to go unchecked entirely. Zeus intervened. Thetis came again to her son, and this time she came not to hold him, but to tell him plainly that he had to stop, that the gods required it, that Hector deserved burial and Priam deserved his son. It was a measure of where the grief had taken Achilles, that it required divine instruction to reach him. He had been somewhere past the edge of human behavior for days, operating in a register of rage and loss that ordinary moral calculation could not penetrate. The gods calling him back was not a defeat. It was the universe setting a boundary that his mother alone could not. What happened next is among the most remarkable scenes in all of ancient literature, and it stands completely apart from everything else in this story in its emotional texture. Priam came, old King Priam, ruler of the greatest city in the ancient world, father of 50 sons, and the husband of the noblest queen in the Troad, came alone in the dark across the plain to the Greek camp, to the tent of the man who had killed Hector, to beg in person, with no weapon and no army and no leverage except the raw, unmediated weight of a father's grief, for his son's body back. The gods guided him safely through the Greek camp. He came to Achilles' tent. He entered. He knelt before the man who had killed more members of his family than any other person alive, and he took Achilles' hands, the hands that had killed Hector, and he kissed them, and he said, "Remember your own father. Remember Peleus, old and distant and waiting for a son who may not come home. I have had to do what no father should have to do. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my child. Honor that. Give me my son." The accounts are careful and consistent about what happened to Achilles in that moment. He wept. They wept together. The old king and the young warrior. For their own dead, for each other's losses, for the grinding consumption of everything the war had taken from both sides, and both peoples, and both families. Two men from opposite sides of the most catastrophic conflict of their era, sitting together in the dark and sharing the one thing that required no translation. Achilles agreed. The body of Hector was returned. A truce was called for the burial. The funeral fires burned for 9 days on the Trojan side. The city mourned properly, with the time and the rituals that mourning requires. And the war, briefly, paused. But the plain was still waiting, and the grief that had produced one truce was not finished producing consequences. It had only just begun its next chapter, and that chapter's first word was written in Amazon blood. Penthesilea arrived at Troy not long after Hector's burial, and her arrival was the kind that changes the atmosphere of a conflict. She was queen of the Amazons, the legendary warrior women of the Euxine steppe, whose military culture had produced fighters of exceptional quality for generations. And she came with 12 of her finest warriors, and the specific energy of someone who had made a decision they were completely at peace with. She had killed her sister Hippolyte accidentally in a hunting tragedy, and carried the guilt of it like armor she could not remove. Coming to Troy to fight and die was, in its way, both penance and purpose. She wanted a war that meant something. She had come to the right place. She was extraordinary on the battlefield. This is not the embellishment of later legend making. The accounts are specific and consistent about her effectiveness in the days she fought on the Trojan plain. She drove the Greeks back with a ferocity and tactical intelligence that reignited Trojan morale in the way that a fresh, full-strength force arriving at the precise moment of deepest exhaustion will always do. She killed. She led. She moved through that engagement with the kind of brilliant, committed competence that earns the respect of enemies even as they are trying to stop her. Achilles killed her, and what the ancient sources recorded about that moment, the specific, unexpected weight of it, was that when her helmet came off and he saw her face, Achilles was struck by something he had not anticipated. Some accounts name it grief. Some name it something more complicated. Whatever it was real enough to be recorded, real enough to be remarked upon by the men around him, real enough to make the victory feel, in its immediate aftermath, like a more ambiguous thing than victories usually felt. He had killed something remarkable, and even in the midst of everything that had brought him to that moment, he was not too far gone to know it. Thersites, a Greek soldier of negligible talent and considerable viciousness, mocked him for it, made jokes about Achilles weeping over a dead enemy queen. Achilles killed him too, in the same motion, with a single punch that the accounts describe as essentially casual, and that did not appear to cost him much deliberation. Thersites was not mourned. Memnon came next, prince of Ethiopia, son of the goddess Eos the Dawn, and by several accounts the most beautiful man anyone in the war had yet seen. He was also a genuinely dangerous fighter, with divine parentage that put him in Achilles' own category of inherited advantage, and he came with a force large enough to matter and armor forged from divine hands that echoed Achilles' own Hephaestan equipment. He killed Antilochus, son of Nestor, one of the Greeks Achilles had genuinely cared for, a young man of warmth and promise who died protecting his father from Memnon's spear. Nestor, ancient and unable to fight effectively any longer, was being run down. Antilochus interposed himself and died for it. Achilles was watching. He engaged Memnon, and the outcome was not foreordained. This was the closest thing to an equal contest the war had produced since Hector, and the gods themselves reportedly suspended their certainty long enough to weigh the scales. Eos the Dawn pleaded for her son, as Thetis had always pleaded for hers. Zeus weighed the fates. The scales tipped. Memnon fell. The Dawn wept, and her grief became the morning dew that has covered the earth every day since, which is how the ancient world explained something that needed explaining. The greatest fighters Troy could find or summon had been faced and defeated. The war's mathematics had been exhausted in one direction. The plain was covered in the evidence of what Achilles had done, and Apollo had been watching all of it with the attention of a god, who had a specific grievance going back to Troilus at the altar, going back to 9 years of watching his Trojan favorites die, going back to every offense that accumulated in the ledger of a divine being who did not forget. He had been patient. He had waited. He was finished waiting. He went to Paris, beautiful, arrow-gifted Paris, who had started all of this with a golden apple and a choice between 3 goddesses. And he guided the shot. That is the essential thing to understand. Paris did not kill Achilles through any particular brilliance of his own. He was the instrument. Apollo was the hand behind the instrument, directing the arrow with the precise divine intelligence of someone who knew exactly where the one small, mortal, unwashed sliver of the greatest warrior alive was located. The arrow flew. It found the heel, and Achilles, who had killed Cycnus and Troilus and Hector and Penthesilea and Memnon, who had fought a river god and routed entire armies and dragged the greatest of Troy's defenders around the walls of his own city, who had been built from the ground up by an immortal mother and a centaur philosopher, and the brutal education of Mount Pelion, fell, not to a warrior, not to a blade, not to any force that had earned the right to take him in open contest, to a guided arrow, to a god's grudge, to the one place his mother's hands had been. Ajax and Odysseus stood over his body and held the Trojans off while the Greeks carried him back to the ships, fighting backward, covering the retrieval, making sure the body of Achilles received the same protection from desecration that Achilles had been too consumed by grief to give Hector and had to be instructed by the gods to finally provide. The irony was not lost on the ancient world. It is not lost now. He was burned on a funeral pyre with honors that the Greeks had given to no one else in 10 years of this war. The Myrmidons cut their hair and laid it on the flames. Thetis came up from the sea one final time, and the Nereids with her, and the sound they made for Achilles on that beach was something the survivors of Troy would describe for the rest of their lives as the most beautiful and most terrible sound they had ever heard. The Greeks held funeral games in his honor, the finest athletes competing in the shadow of the loss of the finest athlete. And then, because the war was still unfinished, because Troy still stood on its hill above the plain, because fate still had its final architecture to complete, they buried him, and they dried their tears, and they thought about what came next. The walls of Troy had not fallen, but Achilles was gone. The man who could not be stopped had been stopped. The man fate had ridden into the victory had played his part and paid his price. And now the Greeks were standing on the far side of that loss, looking at a city that still needed taking. Odysseus was already thinking. He had been thinking for a while. He had an idea. It required wood and time, and the particular willingness to be patient that Achilles never had, and Odysseus always did. It involved a horse. Troy fell. The horse worked. The walls that had stood for 10 years came down in a single night of fire and betrayal, and the particular chaos that follows when a city discovers too late that the gift left on its doorstep was never a gift at all. But that is someone else's story, because Achilles was already gone, already ash and bone and memory on a beach in the Troad, already transitioning from man to something the world could not stop returning to, already becoming, in the months and years and centuries that followed. Exactly what he had chosen to become when he stood at the crossroads of two fates and pointed himself deliberately at the shorter, brighter road. Immortal. 3,000 years is a long time for anything to survive. Languages die, empires dissolve into geography. The names of kings who controlled vast territories and commanded armies of hundreds of thousands are lost so completely that we do not even know what languages they spoke. History is ruthless in its editing, and what it keeps is rarely what anyone predicted it would keep. It kept Achilles, Alexander the Great, himself arguably the most gifted military commander the ancient world would produce after this story ended, carried a copy of the Iliad on every campaign he ever fought. He slept with it under his pillow alongside a dagger. He visited the tomb of Achilles at the start of his Persian campaign and ran around it naked, as tradition demanded, honoring the hero before he went to make his own history. He openly, unapologetically modeled himself on Achilles. The speed, the ferocity, the absolute refusal to accept the limitations that other men accepted. He wanted to be the next iteration. He was, by most assessments, the closest anyone ever came. The Romans absorbed him into their own founding mythology, linking Achilles' legacy to the lineage of Aeneas, threading the thread of Troy into the origin story of Rome itself. Achilles was not just a Greek hero. He became a foundational figure of Western civilization's self-understanding, the template against which every subsequent idea of the exceptional individual was measured. The philosophers took him apart, looking for meaning. Plato used him to argue about the nature of courage and honor. Aristotle cited him when discussing the relationship between greatness and ethics. The Stoics wrestled with his rage as a case study in the cost of unmanaged passion. Every era found in Achilles the specific argument it needed, which is the hallmark of a figure who has transcended their own story. In the centuries that followed, in the medieval romances, the Renaissance paintings, the Enlightenment literature, the Romantic poetry, Achilles kept reappearing, kept being reinvented, kept meaning something new to whoever picked him up without ever fully losing what he had meant before. He became a symbol of doomed excellence, of beauty inseparable from violence, of the unbearable collision between what a person is capable of and what that capability costs them and everyone they love. In our own time, he lives in novels, in films, in video games, in the way we casually use his name. Achilles' heel. Every single day, without thinking about the beach, the mother, the river, the heel, the arrow, the god's grudge, we have worn his most intimate vulnerability into a figure of speech so common that it requires no explanation in any language that English has touched. That is an extraordinary kind of permanence. The man has been dead for 3,000 years, and his body is still in the cultural conversation. What does he represent, finally? What has survived all that retelling, all that reinterpretation, all that distance? Perhaps this, the idea that a life lived with total commitment to its own nature, even a dangerous nature, even a flawed and fire-prone and ultimately self-consuming nature, is worth something. That the short, bright road, chosen freely and walked without flinching, leaves a mark that the long, quiet road does not. That excellence, real excellence, the kind that costs everything and asks no permission, is one of the things human beings cannot stop looking at, even when it frightens them, especially when it frightens them. He was not a good man by any simple accounting. He was a great one, and the ancient world, for all its remove from ours, understood something we are still working out, that those two things are not the same, and that the distance between them is where all the most interesting stories live. Achilles chose fire. The fire is still burning.